Here we go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Venezuela at a Crossroads, Political Developments and U.S. Relations. This event is jointly sponsored by the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University and Columbia Journalism School. I'm Eduardo Moncada, Director of the Institute of Latin American Studies and Associate Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and Columbia University. The Institute, the ILAS, is Columbia's hub for research, teaching, and dialogue on Latin America. We bring together faculty, students, and visiting scholars across disciplines with communities of Latin American origin in the United States. And in that spirit, and together with the Journalism School, we've convened today's discussion to help make sense of some fast-moving developments in Venezuela and their implications for the region. On October 10th, María Corina Machado, one of Venezuela's leading opposition figures, received the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize, a longtime advocate of free and fair elections. She won a record vote for the National Assembly in 2010 before being expelled in 2014, and now leads Vente Venezuela. She also helped found Soy Venezuela, which brought together diverse pro-democracy opposition movements in the country. And meanwhile, since August, the United States has expanded its military presence off the Venezuelan coast and parts of the Caribbean, officially in the name of combating drug trafficking. And that's included lethal strikes on vessels allegedly involved in drug transport and new designation of certain cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. These moves and the rhetoric surrounding them may signal a new phase in U.S. policy toward Latin America, one that merits careful scrutiny and debate. And to help us think through these developments, we're thrilled to have three distinguished guests. We have two panelists. First, Dorothy Kronick, Associate Professor of Political Science, whose research focuses on contemporary Latin American politics, especially Venezuela. Her work examines democratic backsliding, crime, and the unintended consequences of security policies. Her scholarship has appeared in American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, and a slew of other top journals in the field. And her commentary on Venezuela has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. Boris Muñoz is a Venezuelan-American journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, The New Yorker, Gato Pardo, among others. He founded the New York Times en Español opinion page and has authored several books, including La Ley de la Calle and Despachos del Imperio. Boris is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Maria Moores Cabot Award from Columbia University, a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, and a Public Policy Fellowship at the Wilson Center. And as our moderator today, we have Roberto Patiño, an entrepreneur, a co-founder of Mighty Labor and president of Institute 2100, a think tank focused on migration, technology, and international affairs. Roberto also founded Mi Convive and Alimenta la Solidaridad, two of Venezuela's largest grassroots networks. He's currently, we are fortunate to have him as a visiting scholar at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University as well. And Roberto, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity and creating the space for this conversation. We have a phenomenal opportunity to understand what's going on and try to make sense of it with two very renowned and experts such as Dorothy and Boris. So we'll kick it off with Boris. Boris, we want to take advantage of having you as a journalist here in the panel. And I would love for you to give us an overview of the latest developments with respect to Venezuela, so our audience can have the details of what's going on, and then we'll make sense of it.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you, Roberto. I just want to disclose that I'm a bit under the weather, so my voice may sound like a rusty tenor sax or something, you know. But I'm very happy to be here among friends and talking about this very difficult issue for us Venezuelans, you know. I don't know if students know that since around mid-August, the United States unexpectedly started deploying a big the deployment of naval assets in the Caribbean. Several like warships, maybe 4 nuclear submarine, and a total of 10,000 troops. That was kind of a big surprise in the backyard. Today, they actually last Friday, Secretary of Defense or of War, Pete Hegseth, announced also the deployment of a carrier air carrier, one of the largest in the world. So the total amount of U.S. military force that is deployed now in the Caribbean Sea is about 8% of the American military power, which is something that seems out of proportion in the context of what they see or what they defend as the justification for this use of force. They are targeting they are targeting apparently drug votes in an effort to stem drug smuggling into the United States. They say they are focused on fentanyl, cocaine, and other things, but we know that Venezuela is not a known route for fentanyl. The usual route for fentanyl is the southern border with Mexico, because those drugs are made in Mexican drug labs or narco labs. So this the idea of these narco boats that have been bombed as the real reason for this deployment is questionable. There has been a lot of criticism going on in both Washington and Latin America about this move. And a lot of people say, well, we don't buy it. We don't think you are, your main objective is controlling the smuggling of drugs to the United States. But people say they believe that the real reason is the regime change in Venezuela. So in either way, what this military effort is showing is a lot of pressure directed toward the Maduro regime to either produce a crack in the military that will create an internal crisis that will either push for Maduro oust from this internal crisis, or will lead to an escalation, a larger escalation in military action from the U.S., now targeting military objectives in the Venezuelan territory. And President Trump has mentioned this over several times. He has said that they are now, they control the sea, meaning the U.S. Military, and they are now, they will aim to land objectives. So we haven't seen that happening yet, but we are expecting that this might be the next step in this escalation. It's a very complex issue. Colombia is being getting involved because President Petro has claimed, President Gustavo Petro of Colombia, that the U.S. is forcing an imperialistic intervention in Latin America. And he has been using this issue. So the situation is evolving and becoming more complex as we talk. I think it's very important to add a layer of context here. And I think that Dorothy can talk way better than I do about the electoral background of this situation, because we have to take in consideration that this crisis is the consequence of another crisis that started a year ago when the Maduro regime stole the election that was legitimately won by Edmundo González Urrutia, who took, apparently, according to the tallies, 70% of the vote. So, but I'm not going to I'm not going to go to that issue. I'm gonna let Dorothy to give
Yeah.
more context on that.
Thank you, Boris. And thank you for making it to the webinar, even without feeling at your best. Dorothy, so I would follow on or build on Boris' suggestion. I want the audience to know that Dorothy is among the scholars that know the most about Venezuelan electoral system. She's been writing and researching about this topic for a very long time. So it's a privilege to have you speak about that. Dorothy, can you give us an overview of what has happened with elections in Venezuela that could have been the ideal and the constitutional mechanism to resolve this crisis?
Oh, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. Roberto, it's great to see you. Eduardo, Boris, so great to see you. I will give an electoral overview, but first, just one pin on something that Boris said. So Boris was beginning to lay out the possible outcomes of what could happen next and mentioned two very possible outcomes, one of which is that in response to the mere threat of military action from the United States, there's some sort of fracture in the Venezuelan military and they push Maduro out. And I agree with Boris, that's one possibility. Boris also mentioned another possibility is that that doesn't happen, and then there are strikes on Venezuelan soil, whether are on, airstrips allegedly used to transport drugs or small ports allegedly used to transport drugs, or as Boris mentioned, the air defense systems and military targets, and then that leads to Maduro's ouster. And so I think Boris is totally right. Those are two possibilities. But I just want everyone to know up front, I think there is another possibility, which is that there are, with or without strikes, Maduro stays in power. I mean, just so everyone has this clear up front, obviously, if the Trump administration were to decide to use the full force of the US military to oust Maduro, he would be gone. But I do not think that decision has been made. In fact, the administration has been clear that that decision has not been made. And so there is also a possible future in which there are no strikes, or there are strikes on these drug trafficking related targets, and then the US moves on and Maduro stays in power. So we could talk about the likelihood, but I just wanted to, if we're listing possibilities, we got to get that one out there as well. Now, in electoral background, here's what I would like everyone to understand. There was a presidential election in Venezuela last year, and Nicolas Maduro, the current president dictator, lost in a landslide to opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, who was backed by María Corina Machado, winner of this year's Nobel Peace Prize. And what I want everyone to understand is often when opposition forces win elections in non-democratic regimes, we kind of know, but we don't really know. Like they're saying Putin lost and stole the election, right? But we don't really have any proof, and we know, but then the press will say allegedly, or it's a disputed election. That is not what happened in Venezuela last year. So as Roberto mentioned, Venezuela has this very unusual voting technology in which there are electronic voting machines, but every voter gets a paper receipt, and every machine prints out a tally at the end of the day with the sum of votes from that machine. And that system, and I could talk for the entire hour about how it works, and but the short version of the story is, through an extraordinary effort of mobilizing thousands of volunteers, the Venezuelan opposition collected more than 80% of these paper receipts and was able to show that Edmundo Gonzalez won in a landslide. And so I get frustrated when I see press reports talking about a disputed result or alleged fraud. No, I mean, and in addition to all of that, there was a parallel tabulation effort by a totally different team that collected receipts from a specific sample of polling places. And so we know the opposition won the election last year. So that's just a point of background in response to your question.
Thank you, Dorothy. Boris, I would also ask you to come in this question and help us understand the broader context with the political, human rights, and economic situation in Venezuela. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to make clear that I didn't venture on possible scenarios. I just described what the current situation was, because certainly, as Dorothy pointed out, there is a status quo, which is Maduro stays in power, can remain, can continue. That would be, I think, the worst possibility for Venezuelans, because all this expectation, all these movements to produce nothing would be really sad, and it would be the wrong message that will probably have a high cost for the opposition. Uh, and that leads to your question, Roberto, because maybe it's very important for students to understand what's the situation in Venezuela now. It's a country that is been going on for a humanitarian crisis for almost 10 years now. The levels of malnutrition, I don't know if that's the right word, are staggering. Maybe 60 or 70% of the population. Inflation. Venezuela went through the highest hyperinflation in the world, registered in the world, over the period of 2016, 2020, around that era. And now that inflation is coming back. Inflation for this year is 500%. 500. I don't know of any other country in the world that has such a big inflation not right now. If we see what salary is for Venezuela, it's $1 per month. There are several bonuses that the government can give, the amount $160 for some of the workers, but the reality is that getting by in Venezuela is extremely hard, economically. Also, services are collapsed. Electricity is totally unreliable. Big blackouts still going on in the country almost every day. Running water is totally also disrupted. Health care is in shambles. So the sum of all these aspects give you the idea of that it's a country with no future, which is a real paradox, because it's an oil-rich country, a mineral-rich country, but it's ruled by a narco-kleptocracy. So I think that's something to take into account that will help understand people why it's so important to take bold action in Venezuela, which doesn't mean a military invasion. I think that's that I want to be clear on that. I don't like to see my country being invaded by the United States or any foreign power. But I also think that something needs to be done at this point, because the legitimate government is out of the government, and a illegitimate ruler is being maintained by force of repression. There is a repression campaign against the population, not only the opposition. Of course, the opposition, María Corina Machado has been in hiding for over 1 year now. All of her contributors or collaborators either have had to leave the country or are in hiding. And that's a reality for a big part of the opposition. Today in Venezuela, there are 18 journalists in jail. So, as I said, the general picture is of a country with no future. So something needs to be done. I hope that now that this military deployment is a fact, is happening, and I suppose that the political figures that are behind this action have some sort of plan. I think that the military pressure leads to some sort of negotiation. And there are several indications that this negotiation may be possible. For instance, Qatar has been mentioned as a possible broker in this negotiation. Yesterday, President Lula of Brazil said that he might be part of a negotiation with the Maduro regime, which is kind of good news in general. Though I wouldn't trust that as a solution for the problem. You know, I think that we need to join forces, join efforts in order to be able to produce a negotiated transition, not by force, but by this nomenclatura in power to leave country, but also allow for working in dismantling the organized crime networks that are enmeshed in the economy and the political structures of Venezuela.
Thank you, Boris. And I believe that one piece of context that it's also important to introduce is that Venezuela has the largest migration crisis in the world, with 8 million people having left the country because of what you and Dorothy have described so far. And the numbers of 2025 continue to grow. It's difficult to know before the year ends, but for sure, it's still in the hundreds of thousands of people living in the country, mostly now to the south, right? And also to Spain because of the new policy in the US with respect to migrants.
And let me add, Roberto, to that point, which is one of the most important points. And I think that's one of the factors that is driving this military action too, you know, because that is a double-edged situation, because that migratory pressure is not only to the United States, but to many other countries in Latin America and Europe as well, you know. So that's a big problem. And I think that this is creating different kind of incentives to push for a negotiated outcome.
Yeah, if I heard you right, Boris, you kind of outline space on which you believe creative thinking and a solution should be built. You said status quo is not acceptable, but you also don't accept the idea of an invasion, right? So in that space, Dorothy, what alternatives do you see for a solution in Venezuela?
Sure. Well, let me, first of all, Boris, I think, did an amazing job laying out as context the ways in which Maduro's policies destroyed the economy, created tremendous hardship. I would also mention sanctions were a part of that economic decline. There's some great research on the relative contributions of the Maduro regime, who, of course, bears the majority of the responsibility, and sanctions. But there's one other thing I'd like to mention that I think is kind of under-recognized about the Maduro regime, which is it, in addition to having terrible economic policies and being very repressive toward the opposition, has also been extraordinarily violent toward basically poor young men in Venezuela. So for 5 years prior to COVID, this is a government where police were killing 5,000 people a year. These are basically levels of state violence not seen in Latin America in many years, more violent than the Brazilian police, right? So this is maybe not talked about as much, but I think if we want to kind of contextualize the Maduro regime, that's a really important piece as well. So in terms of, I think this is an interesting question you're posing. We have obviously, there's a possibility that Maduro will stay in power through all of this. I wrote in 2019, just as major sanctions were being imposed in the first Trump administration and Guaido was recognized as Venezuela's president, that Maduro has a knack for surviving prophecies of his demise. So we'll see what happens. That's one possibility. Obviously, there's also the possibility of military action from the United States. And I think your question is about what could happen in the middle, right? No military action and Maduro is leaving power. I don't know, but I think some the questions we really need to ask are about the incentives of the Venezuelan military, right? And so one important piece of context as well, and actually Javier Corrales and I talk a bit about this in the article that we published earlier this year, and John Polga has also written a lot about this, is the extraordinary investments that the Maduro regime has made in military surveillance with the support of Cubans, in purging the military, and in the Hasim, I'm not sure how to say in English, but the military intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which has thousands of members. Like, the size of the military intelligence apparatus is huge relative to the size of the Venezuelan military. And so part of the reason that he was able to stay in power last year through the tremendous pressure created by the electoral victory of the opposition that we talked about is because of these tremendous investments in repression within the military, right? And there's just horrible, like, unspeakable accounts of torture of members of the military suspected of not only dissidents, but suspected of dissidents, etc. So I think that's an important piece of context. Another question that we need to ask ourselves when we think about this possibility of a transition without military action is, what kinds of guarantees can the United States, a possible future government, offer to members of the Venezuelan military in terms of immunity from prosecution, right? Because I think we're in a difficult situation where we're, on the one hand, where the US government and certainly the opposition is saying, and there is a lot of truth to this, and I've done a lot of research about drug trafficking in Venezuela, so I'm happy to talk more about that, is saying these institutions are deeply involved with drug trafficking. And I don't think anyone disputes that. But, trust us, without Maduro, we're going to offer guarantees. So those are just two things that I think we need to think about and keep in mind. Is one, the tremendous investment in military surveillance and repression, and two, this question of guarantees. Those are just two things I would think about.
Yeah, thank you, Dorothy. That's very both are relevant and super important questions for us to consider. I wanted to also invite our audience, if you have questions, comments, please do send them on the chat, and we will be taking them into account. So, Boris, going back to you, you mentioned the efforts of Qatar, and you mentioned also Lula offering himself as a mediator, right? Even this morning, I believe he did it. Yesterday was his foreign minister. This morning, he spoke about it after his meeting with Trump. So this also to give the audience some context, last year after the election, there were reports that the Biden administration was putting everything on the table for Maduro to negotiate, and he decided not to do it, right? And even though one of the most significant developments or consequences of the election and the opposition's capacity to prove the fraud was that even their traditional allies in the region started to distance themselves from Maduro. But it's also a reality that the Latin American left left a vacuum, right? And actually didn't propose a solution. Now we're seeing that Lula is trying to take the initiative after the Trump administration has been developing its policy. So help us understand, Boris, a little bit about the context of the Latin American left. What could they do? Why they didn't do it before? And what alternatives do you see in that space where we accept that, status quo can no longer continue, but also military action, it's undesirable for Venezuela?
I think that the military action is questionable, undesirable, is something that we don't want to see, but it's happening. And it's happening in part because what you just mentioned, this vacuum left by mainly by the left, because there were several initiatives in the last decade to help Venezuela transition. There was a group of seven, another kind of initiative that joined or tried to accompany opposition efforts for a transition. But meanwhile, there were several important countries that had been friends with the Chavista regime, either with Chavez or Maduro or both, like Brazil, mainly Brazil, like the Partido de los Trabajadores, Workers' Party, the Mexican left led by López Obrador, and in Colombia, Petro, and others, that had been in Bolivia too, had been like being in solidarity, of course, Cuba and Nicaragua with Chavismo, no matter what, And I will exclude Cuba and Nicaragua because those are dictatorships. But if you see the role that Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia could have played in the crisis last year, you think that there were, I think that a lot of dissatisfaction in the end with their mediation. They at some point, right after the fraud was exposed, they say they were going to mediate in this situation and try to persuade Maduro to accept the results instead of what happened. But nothing happened, So in that vacuum, I think the U.S. Saw an opportunity to act. And there are very strong elements of the Trump administration that want to see that change happen for different reasons. One is Secretary of State and Security Advisor Marco Rubio, who comes from a Cuban family and has always been a staunch defender of American exceptionalism in the region, but also has been very frontal enemy to Cuban revolution, dictatorship, and also an enemy of Chavez and Maduro, and he sees the opportunity of a regime change in Venezuela as a larger change for the region. Senator Rick Scott, Representative María Elvira Salazar, who are part of the Miami group, the Miami lobby, they see that as their mission to help Venezuela transition from this dictatorship to democracy. And on the other side is Stephen Miller, a very important figure in Trump's cabinet, who is also he is the mastermind of the migration policy. It's anti-migration that we are seeing displayed in full force in these recent months. And Miller defends the idea that Trump has to show force in the backyard, and both Miller and Rubio align in the idea that U.S. military hegemony needs to be reestablished in the backyard because the growing influence of China. So I think that they see Venezuela as an opportunity to square all these circles, and also like aligning the region more to a right-wing political trend or project, as they've been trying to really help their allies like Bukele in El Salvador, Milei in Argentina are the main examples. So I think I lost the other part of your question, but I think this is I just wanted to mention that to Dorothy's point, that what she just mentioned, this huge investment in security and in surveillance that Maduro has put forward in recent years is being paying off handsomely for them because that have allowed them to remain in power. But those policies are and those resources that they have in place are very, very dark. You know, they have used methods that Nazis used in Germany, like Sippenhaft. They would kidnap the families of their political opponents in order to exert pressure and bend their opponents in jail or whatever, you know. So this is massive, you know, and I think that people are not well aware of what's going on what's been going on in Venezuela over the past 6 or 7 years, and it's a regime that has grown more, you know, like dark and dangerous, and much less democratic.
Yeah.
It was once.
Thank you, Boris. That gives a lot of light on how dark the regime has actually become and the brutality that has the Venezuelan opposition and civil society in general have faced. Going back to the question about the region before we move on from that question, we have to be fair and say, for example, that Boris from Chile has been very outspoken and because we were talking about the left and has been a voice defending human rights violations, while as you mentioned that, for example, the Mexican government has said nothing of what's happening in Venezuela and has tried to put a lot of distance with the fight of democracy in Venezuela. But Dorothy, when you think about the possibility of the region playing a role, and going back to the two questions that you were asking about guarantees, about the military and the military intelligence and the violations of human rights, this connects to a question that we're receiving from Laura Dib. She says, we've seen many negotiations taking place in Venezuela, but some of these negotiations actually don't lead to democratic openings, right? And she uses the example of the prisoner swaps with Grenell. So can you reflect a little bit on what would it take for a negotiation to work? And if do you see a role for the region there, and what characteristics would that have?
I mean, that's a little above my pay grade. I think if I had a great answer, I wish I did. But let me say two things. First, thinking about the response of the left, the Latin American left last year, you know, folks asked me at the time, what could Lula have done? And that's related to your question about what could Lula do now? What could Lula have done last year? And one thing that comes to mind for me is he could have recognized Edmundo as the winner of the election, not as the president of Venezuela, not like what happened with Guaido, where recognizing him as the president, recognizing him as the winner of the election, as the United States did. And Lula did not do that, right? And so I think that I share Boris's sense that many found that disappointing. Whether I don't think that would have necessarily made a difference in terms of transition, but it would have affected the tone of the global conversation. So that's just an example of something that Brazil could do. What are the conditions under which Maduro leaves power short of military action from the United States? I think it's hard. Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for that. I think it's a very narrow path, right? Because of the constraints that I mentioned before, right? What kind of guarantees can you offer to members of the Venezuelan armed forces who have been involved in drug trafficking and human rights abuses, right? And I am concerned that any set of guarantees that would be acceptable to them might not be acceptable to those who understandably feel that they need to be punished for their crimes. So that's just the difficulty that I see. I'm not sure I have a resolution, but just something to think about.
Sure. Thank you, Dorothy. And we receive another question here from Patricio Gonzalez, who asks, who are the Venezuelan stakeholders who are in contact with the Trump administration, if any? Is Trump being advised by well-informed Venezuelans that can nudge Trump towards the most effective policies and actions? And I will connect that question, Boris, to this concept that at least the way I hear Dorothy frame it, is that the possibility for a transition, a peaceful transition. It's a narrow corridor, right? And for that narrow corridor to really exist, obviously the Trump administration has to be a part of it, and the Venezuelan opposition as well. How do you see that relation playing out?
Very difficult, that's it's I think I wonder if we can ask the moderator to give his opinion here, because you have been part of negotiation efforts in the past, and you have witnessed how Chavismo have has negotiated with the opposition in different moments, and the way they have betrayed some of the compromises of these negotiations. I think last year, before the election, the scenario was, the table was set for uh, the perfect transition, because there were several, like there was like kind of an environment that would allow for some degree of ease in the sanctions that these uh, political figures and government employers would receive if they abandon power in a peaceful way, in a peaceful transition. That scenario stopped being valid when they stole the election. So that has become much more and more difficult. What we knew from a report in the Miami Herald like a week ago is that they are trying, some of the key political figures in the Maduro government, the Rodriguez brother and sister, Delcy and Jorge Rodriguez, are trying to negotiate a Maduro's exit to Turkey.
Boris, I just want to ask you a question about that exact point as a journalist, because this is something I was genuinely wondering. Why was that story only reported in the Miami Herald and not picked up in the Times, the Journal, or the Post?
Well, I think because of the sources, because the sources that the reporter manages, that doesn't make me believe that those reports are not true. Because Qatar has been close to the Maduro regime, and they have tried to negotiate or help in negotiations before, and they have some credit with the Trump administration because of these negotiation efforts in Gaza between Israel and Palestine, etc. So I take it with a grain of salt as well, but I don't think it's unlikely that happened. That may have happened. Yeah, I'm speculating, but that reporter has also published some trustworthy reports on drug smuggling, Cartel de los Soles, and other issues, and he has been in general right. I don't know.
I would also love to.
Yeah,
well, let me jump in to say two things. So first, I think Patricio's question is really important, and I would love to hear Boris's specific answer. This is, who are the Venezuelan stakeholders who are in contact with the Trump administration? So obviously, María Corina is in contact with the administration, or I don't know, obviously, but I would assume María Corina's team is in some sort of contact with the administration. But what I'm wondering, and this is to Patricio's point, is what is the extent and depth of the plans? I mean, my sense is there's a lot of improvisation and unanswered questions, both on the immediate front, like will there be strikes on Venezuelan territory? If there are, where will they be? I sense these questions are being answered as we speak. But then also, if there were a transition, what would happen the next day? Would there be new elections? Would would there be a new Chavista government? I just, my sense, we've had in this discussion a lot of parallels. People like to talk about Iraq and Libya and Panama, right? And I mean, one thing in Panama, I do think, my sense, Boris, tell me if this is wrong, is there was a lot of coordination within that, right? There was this kind of planning. And Patricio, my answer to you is I don't know exactly, what plans are, what's been discussed, but I think that is a key question. And if Boris has any more insight, I would love to hear.
I have some insight, but I don't have a definite insight. I think Maria Corina Machado's team is a team that has been working in coordination to some degree with the administration. And what has transpired so far in the voice of Maria Corina Machado herself and her deputies is that there is a plan for a transition. They say we have a plan for the first 100 hours and we have a plan for the first 100 days. And the way they haven't outlined those plans, but they say they have them. And I don't doubt they have some sort of plan that has been talked about, at least talked about with the Department of State. But I don't know details about that, And what I know, and I think this is for certain, is that Machado's teams know that there are more actions being outlined somehow, but they don't know when those actions are going to happen, and what the military objectives are, and what the degree of the military involvement is in those actions. So that's what I'm sharing what I know, and but I think that my concern, as a Venezuelan, as a journalist, and also as a U.S. citizen, is what is the end game of the administration? What is the degree of commitment the administration has with a not only a shift of power in Venezuela, but the general future of Venezuela, because we see the interest of the administration, of the U.S. government, clear: migration, control of key resources in Venezuela, oil, gold, and other minerals, also control of criminal organizations, terrorists, whatever. I think those are clear objectives of the U.S., but I don't see what the plan to carry those out is, and that's.
I agree with I agree, Boris. I don't think it's clear. It is not clear at this point whether the Trump administration is committed either to strikes at all, certainly to regime change, or to democracy in Venezuela. I don't see a lot of reason to think that the administration is committed to any of those things. I see a question, Roberto, from Susana in the chat, and that I think is important. And she says, you're talking about a negotiation, but in what scenario would Maduro or his close circle relinquish power? Is there something to negotiate? And I think that's coming back to what we were discussing before. For me, it's very hard to see. I also wanted to say on migration, we have not talked about the Trump administration's policies toward Venezuelan migrants. And I think that's really important. So just by way of background, in March, the administration sent hundreds of Venezuelans to a maximum security prison in El Salvador with very little due process, US courts have basically stopped that, and they were eventually released and sent back to Venezuela, but only after, months of confinement in under these very difficult conditions. Venezuelan journalists, US journalists have done a lot of work to find that many of them don't have criminal convictions. Many of them entered the United States legally. And I think as part of this, there's also been the Trump administration's effort to revoke temporary protected status for Venezuelans, meaning that hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who had temporary protected status would be at higher risk of removal, and their conditions living in the United States are getting more difficult. So I think just thinking about, as we're talking about Trump's policies in the Caribbean and toward Venezuela, it's important to think about those policies toward migrants as well.
And those are narrowly connected, I think, like they are tightly connected, those two aspects, because of course, if the Trump administration manages to bring change about in Venezuela, that will help ease the migratory pressure domestically, and will also help.
Maybe.
Well, maybe,
maybe.
I
mean, in the best case scenario, definitely.
I think that.
But there are a lot of scenarios, even if there is a transition, there's a lot of scenarios that would not result in less immigration.
Yeah, no, that's true. But if there is a regime change that opens the country for Venezuelans to come back, and there are incentives, that is more likely to happen than not. Especially considering in the United States that the anti-migration sentiment and all the policies that you have mentioned, the actions anti-Venezuelans or anti-Venezuelan migrants, TPS, parole, etc. So yeah, I think that scenario is likely. Also, that will help Trump's image in the Venezuelan community that has been deteriorating over this year because all the actions he has taken against Venezuelans. 600,000 Venezuelans are now in legal limbo and may have to leave the country. So if he manages to help the opposition get to power in Venezuela, that I will assume that will help him greatly here with Venezuelans and other Latino or Hispanic communities, both ways, especially thinking about midterm elections and
Yeah.
that,
Boris, so going back to your question to me about negotiations, so I've always been of the view that negotiated outcome is in Venezuela's interest, but obviously the negotiation has to be for a transition, not to maintain status quo with different configurations. So that's kind of the crux of the matter. The how to find that narrow corridor has been eluding not only Venezuelans but the international community that has tried to help. We see here a question by Julie Skursky saying, could you comment on the report that Maduro offered to open Venezuela's oil and mineral resources to the US? If true, what does this indicate about Maduro's power? And I would add another element of this past weekend, which was after the events in last week in the Vatican with the two new saints that were canonizado. I don't know how to say that in English, which was very important for the Venezuelan people. We saw that the cardinal tried to reach Isnotu, the town of Jose Gregorio Hernandez, and it was blocked. So can you give your briefly comments on how do you see Maduro's power with these developments?
Well, I see Maduro. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, well, let me just jump in quickly to say, so Julie, yeah, hi, first of all, nice to you, and thanks for your question. I think one thing that Boris and I neglected to mention when we were listing the sins of Chavismo is the all but destruction of PDVSA, right? Like the lack of investment in and firing human capital, physical capital in PDVSA under Chavez and under Maduro has been really devastating. And then that plus sanctions has just really been extremely damaging for the Venezuelan oil industry. And so my sense from folks who work on oil is if we're ever going to get production back up to a reasonable level, which obviously would be very good for the Venezuelan economy, they're going to need tremendous amounts of investment, right? And so I do think, as that report that you're mentioning suggested, the fact that if it is true that, the government is offering, to allow folks into the industry on very favorable terms, that may be a response to pressure, that may indicate some, concern about possible strikes, but it's also read as like this sector, they're going to, even in the best case scenario, they need tons of foreign investment to get production back up, right? So I'm not sure how to read that in terms of Maduro's power. And then on the canonization, Boris, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
No, I mean, I think that the canonization and popular support for the saints, and particularly the action against Monsignor Porras, is that Maduro is weaker than we think, because if they are afraid of a cardinal giving a mass in a very far away cathedral in the country, I think they are showing that they are more scared of the people than we thought. It's because of course this Maria Corina Machado has been like a very powerful voice in trying to own somehow this religious connection with the people. She has become a Mariana, almost nearly religious figure, and that's a very interesting transformation of what she has been as a social leader, because she comes from civil society, very technocratic, and she has become more a charismatic, religious-like figure. So I think that the government is reading that she represents a sort of a threat in that regard, and that's why they don't want any like major religious figure trying to build up or capitalize on this canonization.
Boris, we're gonna have to start wrapping up. This is such an interesting conversation. Next Sunday, one of the most famous races is happening in the city where this university is based, the New York City Marathon. So just as a final comment, is Venezuela in the last mile of a marathon?
That's for Dorothy.
I don't think it's obvious at all. I mean, what I would just caution against, Roberto, is there have been press features recently that have this tone of, well, either Maduro will flee the country, or he'll be deposed by the military, or he'll be killed by the US military. And I think it is a big mistake to think of those as the only three possible outcomes. And we need to take very seriously the possibility of a baseline scenario in which Maduro stays in power. We need to recognize that that is a possibility.
Thank you. Any final comments on your end, Boris?
Well, I think that, as Dorothy said, is the possibility that Maduro remains is real, and he has been a survivor for all these years. But I think that it's not a fatality. I think that a change is possible. We have to pursue change through a negotiation. We should avoid military bloodshed in Venezuela, certainly, but I think that we as Venezuelans and responsible people, we have to try to push for change. And what Trump did is that he put a big gun on the table, and said, let's try to settle this now, and I hope that this somehow helps find new avenues. I'm not advocating for military action in any way. But I think that there are new conditions that may allow for a different approach and may end in helping a way out for this dictatorship and start reconstructing democracy. I don't want to think that is not possible. I want to think that we need a different future in Venezuela.
Thank you, Boris. And I believe that me as a Venezuelan as well, but also the vast majority of Venezuela is aiming for the same result, which is a democratic transition that it's as peaceful as it could be. So thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Boris, for making the time. Thank you, Ilas, for organizing, and thank you to everyone who stayed until the end.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.